Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Karlien Strijbosch will defend the academic thesis Challenging Masculinities, Senegalese men returning from Europe to Senegal under conditions of deportability. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Dear highly esteemed pro-rector, distinguished members of the Corona, dear supervisors, colleagues, families and friends, including those online. People coming to Europe are often in the news and topics of conversation in political debate. But what happens to those who leave Europe? The central goal of this dissertation has been to understand how men who migrated from Europe to Senegal position themselves upon return. Migration, both within the African continent and beyond, has been part of the family histories for centuries. The impact is visible in the form of half-constructed houses, school fees financed by migrants, and the messages and calls of those abroad. Research has demonstrated that migration, particularly for men, can provide higher social standing and a means of coping with under- and unemployment. Men strive to become someone, be independent and responsible, to provide financially for their elderly parents and for their family, or they aspire to become globally connected. But migration can also be deadly and create suffering and frustration. Many Senegalese know someone who lost their lives in the sea or the desert, or they got their visa rejected. Previous research has shown that return and deportation are life events, with often intense emotions involved. Those coming back are at risk to be seen as criminals or stupid enough to be sent back. They also face the difficulty of starting again in their previous home country. In this dissertation, I focus on Senegal. And Senegal is selected due to its ongoing connection with the European Union concerning migration and return. In the former French colony, European states aim to halt or illegalize migration. The EU finances and supports, for instance, police patrolling the border, and there are information campaigns to deter migration. In European migration policy, Senegal is considered as a safe country of origin. This means that it's assumed to be safe for Senegalese migrants to go back, and it can increase the chances of Senegalese nationals to be seen as deportable. At the same time, on a regular basis, people arrive and return to the EU and back. This would make it likely that I could find people who would participate in my study. So I therefore also chose Senegal. There are different forms in which you can return. States can return migrants through, for instance, deportation, for instance, with a charter flight and handcuffs. There are also softer ways of state-induced return, which are so-called voluntary return programs. Here, non-governmental organizations can provide transport and some support after return. The flyers on the left of the slide are an example of this. But if migrants don't cooperate, they can still be deported, which makes the distinction between voluntary and involuntary return blurry at best. To avoid this politicized distinction, I talk about deportability in my work. This refers to the possibility that any of the study participants could have been removed from the country in which they were living in Europe prior to returning to Senegal, because of their uncertain or soon illegalized status, although not all were returned with force. In this dissertation, I focus on men, because in particular, black and brown heterosexual men are often seen as more deportable by European states. They can be perceived as dangerous and less likely to be seen in need of help or vulnerable than, let's say, women and children. This led me to the following research question. How do Senegalese migrants who arrived from Europe to Senegal under conditions of deportability narrate and perform their return as men? To investigate this, I conducted a year of ethnographic research, starting in Senegal, mostly with returnees themselves, but also with their social surroundings. I spoke to 40 men and 5 women who returned, and of these, I followed 12 for an extended period of time. I also participated in daily activities and events. This could be, for instance, being joining family gatherings, visiting them at work, or playing sports. Doing the research in Senegal, I observed an unexpected connection that I did not read much about in the literature. This was between the German volunteers and Senegalese returnees. To understand this connection better, I went to Germany and also interviewed 14 volunteers who remained in touch with returnees while they met each other in Germany. Their stories became also part of this dissertation, and I will extend upon this in the last empirical chapter of my work. I will now share the main results of my dissertation following the empirical chapters of my dissertation. In the first empirical chapter, I argue that masculinities ideals can both be empowering and painful after return. Returnees referred regularly to masculine ideals while talking about their migration experiences. They rarely challenged the idea of being tough and strong and the need of being a family provider, despite their previous or current difficult situation. Amadou is an example of this, when I met him a couple of months after his deportation and asked him how he was viewing his return from Germany. He said, "Alhamdulillah, I will never let my head down. No. I'm young, I'm a man. Everything that will come is okay." Secondly, this chapter shows that the importance of practices of silencing. While Mamadou was one of the returnees relatively open about his second experience of deportation, he did not talk about it all the time. That he talked at all, and was even on national television to challenge the policy of the Senegalese state, was quite exceptional. Several of the returnees I met were at most ambiguous about their legal status and conditions of their return. They would protect themselves and their family from the stigma and pain that can come with return. Despite their at times devastating experiences, they would, for instance, say they came back temporarily for business or holidays. Some saw it as a duty as a Senegalese son and husband not to speak out. Others would be afraid that people would not understand or think they are complaining. Seeing this was for me an important reason to talk about returnees in my work, and not just, for instance, about deportees, as this would exclude people who would be ambiguous about their reasons for returning, and this was harder to find them also. In the second empirical chapter, Why Did You Not Marry in Europe?, how black migrant men challenged moralizing and racializing discourses when returning to Senegal, I show how masculinities ideals relate to ideas about marriage and the possibility to obtain papers through marriage. Marriage migration is highly scrutinized by European states. Yet, despite the limited options for Senegalese to enter or stay in Europe legally, I show how Senegalese returnees challenge the idea that men want to marry a European resident at all costs. It was exactly through their exclusion from Europe and their return to Senegal that they challenged genders and racialized narratives about dangerous and hypersexual black Muslim men. Mamadou, almost the same as Amadou, who came back through a charter flight, explained, "I cannot just give myself like that for papers. Marriage is important and something you do for life. I do not joke around with that. If I did, I would not be in my current situation, right?" Finally, this chapter shows how norms and way of seeing and talking about migrant men in Europe can travel to Senegal and be relevant there. I argue that this can influence the position of returnees, as people might ask, why did you not marry in Europe? This can be relevant in relation to also the international tourists and those working in the development sector in Senegal. It furthermore highlights the inequality and possibilities to travel. In the last empirical chapter, I argue how overseas connections beyond family members can matter after return, and I return to the volunteers. I show how volunteers based in Germany could be important sources of emotional and financial support for returning men. Volunteering women were skeptical about the work of official institutions and were therefore personally engaging with returnees. Bea, a volunteer who I actually met in Senegal, explained, "It's not easy to go back. I would like to know how it really is. Organizations might give a training, but that's often only for 1 week. They give a flight ticket and a little bit of money. But is that enough?" In this chapter, I further analyze how many returnees, like the volunteers, did not fully trust the organizations that would support them after return. But there was also suspicion towards the volunteers regarding their intentions and ability to support. And the circulation of mistrust between the various parties was at times transformed into trust, but there was also a chance that it may fall back into suspicion. There was thus an abundance of emotions, including mistrust, that required work from all the parties involved. Finally, I argue in this chapter that despite, and sometimes because of the shared mistrust, volunteers could become part of the landscape of return and deportation as intermediators. They can shape it by connecting returnees to organizations, working together on businesses, and through their private support. This could make a difference in the position of returning men in Senegal and was therefore relevant for my dissertation. Overall, this dissertation shows the nuances, difficulties, and various connections involved in return. Firstly, it argued how social ideals regarding men matter in migration projects, including in relation to return. Dominant ideals about migrant men can both be painful and empowering, and I show that it takes courage to return and considerable work to be welcome and to stay. Secondly, I argued that return and deportation are effective processes for migrants themselves, but also for their surroundings. It's important to take this seriously, including the various feelings of mistrust that can come with it. Finally, I argue for the importance to keep on looking beyond nation states and to understand the context and to pay attention to the ongoing transnational connections that exist on the level of ideas and the ways of talking about migration, of return, but also between people. All in all, I aim to have nuanced, simplified ideas about migrant men and return migration. Thank you all for your attention, and I now give back the words to the prorector.
Thank you so much for your very interesting presentation. The opposition will now be opened by Professor Dr. Lies Wesseling, Professor of Cultural Memory, Gender and Diversity at our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Maastricht University.
Dear candidates, allerbeste Karlien, I have the pleasure of being the first to congratulate you with the completion of your dissertation. You didn't merely complete your dissertation, you actually wrote a really good one. And what I particularly appreciate about your work is that you have managed to give a name, a face, a human identity to a group of people that tends to be referred to collectively in dehumanizing terms, as a flood, a tide, a tsunami, or worst of all, a bunch of testosterone bombs. And in doing so, delving into individual cases, you raise proper awareness of the complexity of their situation, the differences also in their various plights, the differences in the ways in which they meet the challenges, their strategies. I find that very fascinating and also very urgent and topical, and I'm sad to say it's becoming more topical every day, with the current US president manifesting great enthusiasm for deporting migrants on a different continent, but I think there are definitely transferable insights. So all that matters to me. My question pertains to your application of Raewyn Connell's theory of masculinity to your case studies. Connell, of course, emphasizes time and again that masculinity is a relational and contextual ideal, right? And in Connell's work, that remains perhaps a bit abstract, how that actually works out, and maybe that's a bit contagious, because I feel in your work that remains a bit abstract also. So I would like to now invite you to elaborate in somewhat greater detail how that contextuality and relationality works out in your inquiry into Senegalese men. Because when I catch a glimpse of what masculinity means in the lives of the migrants you have followed, it all seems fairly similar to the ideals propagated by, for instance, the Tate brothers or Thierry Baudet here in the Netherlands. You have to be a good provider. You have to facilitate women in your family to care without caring yourself. You cannot be weak. Failure is not. There's no room for failure in the repertoire of masculinity. So please give us a more concrete idea of what this contextuality and relationality could mean in your case, in your case studies. Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question and the opportunity to elaborate upon this a little bit more for my work. I indeed would argue that masculinity is relational and depending on the context in which it occurs. And I think in my work, the contextual also, even though maybe some of the messages or being strong, being a provider, they might come back in different places as well, I think, or protector, I think what was, for instance, interesting to see was some of the respondents, which you also seen as a second empirical chapter, when I talk about marriage, migration, and returning men. There they would say, one would tell, for instance, how he was protecting against European, he was protecting a European woman against a European man. And also, I think who we are then protecting against, or who we provide for, or what happens can change and be. That's one part of the contextuality. And starting off with other things that I think are important is, even though to know, and I've seen this also throughout my research, that even though men might be seen as or want to be the main provider, it doesn't mean that in practice no women around them provide for some money or finances as well. And also I think it's important to keep in mind how, for instance, the relationality among different men can differ, or you can be in different places, depending also as being strong. Yes, you can be strong, and I saw this also in case studies when I was walking around with some of the with one of the returnees. When I was at home with him, he could show his sometimes vulnerability and pain also related to return. But if I would walk together with him on the street, there would be this big smile, and it would be hard to maybe even imagine that he was suffering inside. So where you show it and to whom matters, and also who you provide to or who you protect for or against, I think matters greatly. And even though maybe some of the terms might be similar, I think there are differences in who needs protection or who needs, and also I think I saw in my work that, for instance, the women, both the men and the women with regards to the volunteers, they would help each other. So there also, it's not only the volunteers that are supporting men, but the other way around. There were also forms of support going on. So it's maybe more multi-directional than I could fully show in my book.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Dr. Rachel Spronk. She holds a chair of Anthropology of Sexuality and Gender at the University of Amsterdam.
Dear candidate, beste Karlien, I have read your thesis with great pleasure. Congratulations on a fantastic work. It is well written, well structured, and well argued. It is well placed within the current debates and adds a new angle to particular discussions, such as Chapter 5 on effect. The focus on the performative, narrative, and effective components of deportability is well found and provides a balanced presentation of the findings and analysis. Letting migrant men speak, explain and show how they perform their return is a strong foundation to critically analyze the tendency in the literature on migration that focuses on the nation state and its institutional fabric. In this way, men speak back to regimes of deportation and the general way they are often represented, and they thus expose the stereotypes on which many policies and politics rest. So the focus on performativity of being a returned migrant is original and it works. At the same time, the strong focus on performativity also reveals a tension, and I would like to discuss that with you. You convincingly argue why intense ethnographic fieldwork has been crucial for gathering data. At the same time, much of the data presented are excerpts of interviews. And interview data go indeed well with performativity, or the focus on performativity. But ethnographic data, there is more to it. So ethnographic data would draw out where interlocutors contradict themselves, the inconsistencies and ambiguities in how they represent and understand themselves, and so on. Take the case of sutura. It is not just the practice of silence, it is an ontological reality that cannot only be perceived and represented in language, such as in an interview. I do buy your argument of the performativity of being a returned migrant, because it's a very legitimate and strong argument. But it's only part of the larger picture, and I would think so. And my question is, do you agree with me? And can you elaborate about the relation between performativity or the analysis on performativity and ethnography, and what kind of data you may have left out because of the focus on performativity?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your interesting questions and the opportunity to elaborate also more on the cases that I might have left out, because indeed this is an ethnographic research, and especially in, you cannot put everything in a book because then it would be way too big. I very much agree with you that sutura is not something you only can talk about, or the practices of silence is something you can only talk about, but that it's also something that needs to be enacted, and that is something that is part of the broader social reality. Actually, this is also how I found out about sutura and the practices of silencing, because at first I might have known or understood how stigma and, or I had an idea, people might be stigmatized when they come back, for instance, through deportation. Yet I didn't fully understand it until I met actually Omar, which is also in my book. he was a returnee. I met him at one of the organizations working on return projects, and he had talked about his experiences in France and how he came back and that he now wanted to start a business. And then soon he went to the airport again to France to finalize his studies in France. And when I met him then 2 years later, we did an official interview, and because a friend told me, oh, maybe he's actually interesting to you for your project. And I thought, why? I didn't fully understand it yet. But then he also explained his previous experience of deportation. So it means that at first he didn't tell also me, for instance, his full story. And I think stories like those of Omad showed me also the importance of staying connected maybe longer, to remain for longer periods of times, that people can also see what I would do or what I would tell them, because it's something also, if you know, you have to be sure that I'm not going to tell it to everybody involved. So that was for me an important moment, and also to see something is enacted. It's not just talked, or like I could not have understood this when I would not be there longer term. So only interviews, maybe if I would have known in advance everything, but you don't. So that's why indeed ethnographic research was important for this study. And to come back, I think, to your questions, the tensions of the contradictions also with Satura, I think maybe it was with actually Amadou, which I also presented in my first in my presentation, where he would say, "Oh, it doesn't matter. Everything that will come is fine." But actually, with him also, I saw he wouldn't tell his full story to everybody when I was following him. So even though he was on television and many people might have known in other places where he might be less well known, he would also still not emphasize this in public, or and he would make sure that besides that he says, "Oh, it doesn't really matter." No, he did care about how other people saw him, because he would make sure that he would be the successful migrant also in other ways. So he would provide some gifts to people. He would still give money, like he would enact this successful returnee. And also still pick and not pick and choose is not the right word, but he did care about how people saw him, and he picked also his moments, and moments where he would be silent again about also his fight against maybe the Senegalese policies of deportation and return. I hope this answers your question.
Can I ask a bit more? Yes. Yes, it answers my question, and because I think this is exactly what I was hinting at. And what have you left out then, maybe? What did not end up in the book? So is it about, do you have data on worries or on sleepless nights? I don't know. Well, what is it that didn't quite fit this frame?
Of Satura, for instance? Or anything. Okay. I think maybe more of the struggles of also when and how to not share or speak up, or maybe also the the differences between people of different statuses and the challenges it might give within family members, both between family members. I have one case, for instance. He was from a well-off family, but he was really devastated after return. And there were quite some tensions also, and he actually wanted to speak out, and he was interested in more relating to the rebels, maybe the rappers or other people that were also vocal, and but then his family was this was not said. This was not something he said literally, but I felt the struggle that he had because he was dependent on his family to also have a place to stay and to be somehow welcomed, even though it was difficult for all of them, but still they were somehow taking care of him. So I think the family dynamics could be further explored actually in future work. And yeah.
Thank you very much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Giulia Sinati, Assistant Professor in the Anthropology of Migration at the VU Amsterdam.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure, Karlien, to be sitting here in front of you. It's been a real pleasure reading your dissertation, which was very moving and profound. And it's also a real pleasure to be sitting here and listening to you answer to the questions that have been posed before me, because you have already shown that your thesis, the book only scratches the surface of what you have done in the last few years. And I have another question about ethnography. What you do in your work is not only present an ethnographic picture of the men and women that you have studied, but you also do a great job in accounting how you navigated the unpredictability that often goes with ethnographic fieldwork. From where are these returnees, actually, figuring that out, managing multi-local fieldwork, your serendipitous encounter with a German volunteer that took your research in a slightly different direction. And these are things that are, they come quite naturally when you're doing ethnographic research, because we often start or we engage in an explorative inductive process and we have very little knowledge at the beginning where the research is going to take us. And what I find you do in your work is you also account very well for this process, for your own journey as a researcher in this work. But there is one question I feel that remains unanswered, and that is the one I'm asking you to answer now. If you could now rewind time, and you were starting the research now with the knowledge and experience that you currently have about Senegalese migration and return, what would you do differently today?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question and also giving me the opportunity to reflect on what I would do differently. I think, maybe in a way there are several things I would like to do different, but on the other hand, I'm also glad how things evolved and to have been open to the various things that have come my way. And I indeed agree that this is an important part of ethnographic research, and I would actually love that everybody who does research has the opportunity to also go with the flow a little bit and to not be too afraid to let go if the path might be slightly not what you anticipated or not what you hoped it in the first place. But nevertheless, there are of course always things you could or would like to do differently. And maybe this would be it's not that I think maybe if I could do it again, or if I can continue, I would love to even focus more on the women and the other family dynamics that have been part and that are definitely part of return. I think this is very important, and the negotiations that happen on a very local, direct basis that you cannot. That are hard to see from a distance, and that are actually very important in the way people come back and if they can stay, what is expected from them. So I think I would even pay more attention to to the direct surroundings of the men themselves, even though I also have to acknowledge that this is very difficult and you have to gain the trust of the people you talk with, and this takes a lot of time. So what I did already now is spending quite some time and just hanging out and being there, but maybe if I could do things differently, I would even even make the group of people that I would follow even smaller, so I could have more time to even go into the very close connections even more than I did in my current work. Yeah.
I'm very satisfied, and this would sound like an amazing postdoctoral research project, actually. So I hope you can do it.
Okay, thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Dr. Arjan Lerkes, Professor of Migration, Securitization and Social Cohesion at Maastricht University, and he's also Associate Professor of Sociology in Rotterdam.
Yes, dear candidate. First of all, allow me to extend my congratulations to you on this, I think, remarkable dissertation. I think you've tackled a complex, important, it's already been mentioned, timely topic with immense intellectual rigor. I think the combination of challenging fieldwork, also partly in COVID times, I think, and transnational, and your ability to interweave empirical insights and theory stand out. I think by adopting an anthropological and transnational perspective on the experiences of these return migrants, men mostly, your work fills, I think, important gaps, or you contribute to the literature, especially like the effective, your focus on the effective aspects of return and how it is performed. I think that's, you elaborate, I think, also the work that has been done on the stigma of return, and maybe also stigma management more generally in sociology. And could have perhaps also implications for policies that maybe we can discuss later on, but that's not my question. I have another question. So in your analysis, you center masculinity. It's a sort of it's a central analytical lens through which you interpret your findings. And I have a question, methodological question about that choice, and because I wonder how, because you did your research among men returning, and also men from a particular region, from West Africa, Senegal, to be more precise. And you haven't conducted research among women, women who are returning, also not men or women from other regions. So based on that selection in your method, I wonder how certain can we be, so that's my question, that these experiences and strategies could be understood predominantly through the lens of masculinity. Because are you able then to rule out other possibilities, that maybe some of the things that you are seeing are maybe not so much tied to masculinity as such, but are maybe related to a more general human search for dignity or respect, which I have also, which we sometimes also see among women, for example. Why isn't it called in search of dignity or in search of recognition? And why is it called challenging masculinities? So that's the question.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question and the opportunity to elaborate a bit more on why I chose masculinity as a conceptual lens to investigate this question. I think for me, one of the main reasons to have the analysis of masculinities central, especially in at the start of my dissertation, was this finding that there are many young men and men in general who migrated from West Africa, and that previous research has already also shown that masculinity or how men are viewed are a part of the Senegalese context. So in a context where there are limited possibilities to provide, where there has been economic crises for several times, and it's just difficult to get by. I think men are under pressure, and it doesn't mean that women are not under pressure, but I would say that in the way of talking about it, men are still the first ones to be seen as responsible for that. I mainly talked about Senegalese men and the ones who went to Europe and came back. Yet I also talked to, this is maybe also one of the things I left out in my thesis, but I did talk to at least a couple of women also who came back to Senegal. Have been in touch with other men who might have been to other places, not to Europe, but either the US or to the to Morocco, to Libya, to Sierra Leone, to other places within the African continent. While I focus on Senegalese men who returned from Europe, I would say there are similar things at work for other men who return back. And I believe that the dignity and that respect you talk about is actually very much part also of masculinity. So it may be not a totally different part of the story, but it was for me a way. Masculinities was for me also a way to deal. How to say it, to the contextuality of masculinities, so that is always in relation, and maybe you could say dignity and respect are also always in relation to other people, but I think there were certain expectations, and also the way masculinities is important for my work. It's not only because maybe Senegalese or people talk about it in that way, but I think also for instance, the European migration policies is very much also gendered, and also pushes certain people to migrate first of all, and also it pushes out certain other type of people, and that's also very much a gendered thing. So in that sense, it's not only how people directly relate to it or do it, but also how the institutions view and categorize certain people. And therefore, I thought masculinities is a particular useful lens for my dissertation to start off with. But I agree that it would be very interesting to elaborate this to other groups of people involved.
Thank you so much. We now have the opportunity for a second round, but before we do so, I look whether we still have the opponent online. Can our technical experts, so I'm now trying to beam in the technical experts to see whether our opponent can join us online. Otherwise, wonderful. Welcome. Can you hear us? Can we actually hear you? Yes, we can also hear you. So before I give you the screen, I will introduce you. Professor Dr. Papa Sako. He holds a chair in urban geography, transport and human mobility at the University of Sheikh Anta Diop. And we would now like to give you the opportunity to ask your question.
Thank you. I think that I can speak in French. So I will be most fluent. Bonjour, je suis content donc de participer à cette soutenance et de voir le travail de Karlien qui arrive à son terme. Alors, moi j'avais une question plutôt sur la posture du chercheur. Karlien, elle est étrangère, européenne. Elle est femme et là, elle affronte le monde masculin sénégalais. La première question, c'était quel a été son sentiment de la perception, de l'attitude que tous ses interlocuteurs ont devant elle quand elle a présenté donc son projet de recherche est d'interviewer des gens. Ça, c'était la première question.
On va maintenant répondre à cette question et peut-être on a aussi la possibilité pour poser la deuxième question. So just to summarize for the audience, the question was about how the researcher herself, how soon to be Dr. Strijbosch, saw her role as a woman in this very masculine world, if I summarize it correctly, as a researcher, and what were the sentiments, perceptions and attitudes you came across.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question, and I will answer in English if that's okay for you. So you were asking me also to reflect upon my positionality and my position as a female European researcher, researching men, and how the people or the men that I was engaging with felt or were dealing with regarding me. And I think this was a challenge from time to time, even though I think many people were open to talk and curious about what I was doing and why I was in Senegal, what I did. People were in general very hospitable towards me as a Western European woman, would easily invite me for dinner, would talk with me, would be curious why I was there, even on small encounters on the street. And this would also sometimes open up already directly conversations or possibilities to connect. I remember, for instance, one instance where I was buying an egg in a boutique, where this directly led to, I was practicing some Wolof, and this directly led to a conversation, and I found out that one of his brothers, actually to the guy I was talking to, was living in the Netherlands. So in general, I think, and he was even visiting Senegal at that point, so I was also invited to their house. So I would say that as a European woman, I was often met with curiosity and openness, and people were willing to talk, but until a certain moment. And then I think that's where you have to stay longer and where you have to keep on continuing talking with people, because there was also mistrust and some suspicion. Why are you here? This was done also in a friendly manner and was asked in a friendly manner, but there was also an underlying thing. Can you be trusted? What are you doing? What are you gonna do with the data? And there was, as there are many Europeans working in Senegal and also involved in, for instance, the stopping of migration, of course I would be easily placed within that category. So this would be something I have to distance myself from other institutions and organizations. And this was for me, after a while, if I come back to also the question, what would you have done differently or what would you do the same? I think eventually in the beginning I was engaging more, or maybe trying to find people also through organizations that work on return or had something to do with migration, but I needed to also have some distance from these organizations to make sure that and to tell people that I was not one of the organizations that would support them or maybe would be of the European government, for instance, that would directly send people back again. So there was, I think, the fact that I was a European young woman opened up possibilities to exchange, to have chats, and I think also there was the privilege of being white, where you could answer certain spaces that might be normally for men, but as a white woman sometimes, because of this maybe in between or position, that I was able to be in places that were sometimes maybe awkward for other people to be, but it gave some opportunity to play around. Maybe it's not the right word, but to deal with that. So I think that helped, and especially maybe the fact that I was a white woman also sometimes helped. And especially when I got to know more of the volunteers, whereas the volunteers were often much more aware of the legal status and the practicalities of what was happening in, let's say, Europe, many of the Senegalese family members, I could also more easily talk between those worlds, and it would allow some of the men I talked to also have someone, where they knew, I knew, but I didn't have to share it with everyone.
Professor Sa, did we understand and answer your question to your satisfaction? We have learned that we have to be spontaneous and go with the flow. So we will now also continue the second round officially with Professor Sprong.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to get another chance, dear Karlien. I would like to go back to the title of your thesis, Challenging Masculinities. Looking at it, it can be read in multiple ways, but I would like to know more about it from the perspective of, for example, I wrote down here, so what happened to the masculinity of Modou, so to say? You start a thesis with a strong vignette of Modou, who found himself deported from Germany, and the vignette shows how the situation involves a larger group of persons. But what happened to him? And I do not only mean in his life, but what can we learn from a person such as Modou on how we usually study masculinity? So here you provide a conceptual framework of masculinity as we do in scholarship, from Judith Butler and Saba Mahmoud on performativity, then weaving in Connell's concept of hegemonic masculinity, and then you give it a bit more flesh through the notion of sutura, by explaining the social expectation of being a man in Senegal, of being a provider, protector, and good Muslim. And this whole framework looks at man, or actually directs our analysis only how men relate to ideals, or how norms and values, how ideas of what a good man is, how they relate to that and how that informs their actions, what they tell, and so on. But not only men, also women, and all of us are not constantly and actively relating to these ideals. So if we leave behind looking at masculinity in relation to these ideals, maybe at well-being or something, what else do you have? I feel your thesis has the potential to add something to the way we usually study masculinity. I'm not sure what, so it's we can explore this together. But you do something. They challenge masculinity because they speak back. They reproduce it, but they also challenge it. So why did you choose for challenging? What do they challenge, and what do we need to add in our frameworks to study masculinity? I hope this is a bit clear.
I will do my utter best to answer. Yes, thank you very much for another question. And I think, indeed, in the opening vignette of the dissertation, I talk about this man who also was actually quite broken when he came back. He was one of the ones who tried to commit suicide just after his return. So the fact that he even did that was and showed was for me a shock. Or it's not that I was not expecting these intense emotions or things that they could happen, but still to see it in practice and to be in this turmoil, kind of where things happen, was intense, but also I saw it as something I can be grateful for, that I was allowed to see that as well. And I think, in a way, maybe challenging masculinities there, it would be also something where it was challenged for him too much. Like he could, I think the fact that you are supposed to be strong, or maybe you have to act, and he felt he couldn't at that point anymore. But so I think maybe if you ask me how can we see masculinities differently or beyond ideals, I think it would be very interesting to share to show the limitations, or to discuss more on the when and how these maybe ideals can be let go of, or where there are moments when they are kind of maybe some more humanity that comes through, that where it applies for everybody, or there might be moments where things are overboard. And I think because this was also a crisis situation in a way, some of the things were let go of. So for instance, also the fact that he was crying, or I think is interesting, and I think it's not just interesting, that's not the right word, but I believe there are moments where these ideals just go out of the corner, or like are not so important anymore. And I think maybe this is something to further explore, like what are the moments where, or the possibilities for both men and women to be different or not fulfill the so-called ideals.
And then without losing being a man.
Sorry?
And then without not succumbing to be a man. So they remain a man. So that's why I thought challenging masculinities, you're also challenging the high ideals by showing, so Modou, I do not know what he did, but he found another way of being a man, and I hope he found a good life. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there is some room to maneuver, and I think, for me this was also why I'm not talking about, this is why the question mark is indeed in my title. It's not that this is how it is and the only thing it could be, but there are certain ways of maybe that are considered to be the most high standing way of doing it, but there are still slightly other ways possible. I think it's important to keep that in mind as well, for sure.
Thank you. We have room for one last question. We'll see how far we come with answering it, from Dr. Sinati.
So I'm going to try and be brief in asking the question so that you have more space to answer. So I'm going to take you from the title of your thesis to the end of your thesis. Because your thesis ends with a really impressive overview of the efforts you made to disseminate your research findings among the scientific community, among professionals, the media. You mentioned also artistic collaborations. I want to try and push you a little bit further on the impact and valorization aspects of your thesis. Beyond the dissemination of scientific results, what practical, constructive suggestions would you have to improve, change, completely scrap assisted return migration programs that were actually the starting point from which you departed this PhD journey? And if you do have recommendations to change, scrap, improve, what would your strategy be to actually promote the actual take-up of your recommendations in assisted voluntary return programs?
Thank you very much for your question. And I think the practical implications or what can be done is something I think about quite a lot, but what comes to, and it's not necessarily so easy, but one thing that comes to my mind right away is very practical things. Some of the returnees I talk to build up some, for instance, pensions in Europe and have other assets which they acquired. But at the moment of return, these were inaccessible for them, especially if the return was unexpected or unprepared. And that these things are unsafe also for them, I think.
Thank you very much for a beautiful defense. The time appointed for defending your thesis has now passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and of your defense today. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Your mind, years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time, cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you won the battle once you grow. Southside, 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time, cause I'll go the extra mile.
Karlien Strijbosch, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and of your defense today. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee here present has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Matsukato is authorized to confer upon you this great academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I now invite your supervisor to take the floor. Please all rise.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
Then by the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Karlien Gertruda Petronella Strijbosch, the degree of doctor, and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Oh.
So, dear Dr. Strijbosch, dear Karlien, lieve familie en vrienden, collega's, as you all know, Karlien's thesis is full of vignettes. In fact, it starts with a vignette. My laudatio will start with a vignette. A warm spring evening. It was a warm spring evening in the end of a workday. My eyes were tired from a day of sitting behind the computer. I was happy to be outside, walking on the Grote Gracht as the evening sun shone at my back. I was pacing downhill and caught something speeding past me at the corner of my eye. I was thinking of nothing in specific when I hear a crashing noise. Boom! I look and I see a blob in the middle of the street. What is it? I ask myself, trying to focus on my tired eyes. I walk closer and I see that it is a person lying in the middle of the street, on their stomach, hands spread out before them, feet up in the air, having just fallen from a bike. I run to see if I can be of help, as the person, dumbfounded by what had just happened, sits up. Oh my goodness, it's Karlien. I run faster. Karlien, are you all right? She nods, looks at her hands, nothing broken, stands up, dusts off her pants. We move the bike from the street to the sidewalk as people gather around. Karlien looks at her bicycle, incredulous. What happened here? We both stare and try to understand. The old bike was split in two. It must have been from the speed and the shaking on the cobbled stone pavement. And we both laugh. Now, this vignette represents the things I have come to know about Karlien. Number one, she is athletic. You should have seen the speed with which she was going downhill on that old bike. And she was always one of the few young people to come by bike to our research retreats in the countryside. And of course, taking half the time that I took with my e-bike. Two, and maybe this is the thing that most impressed me, she is resilient. This thesis was not without its challenges. Not only the usual challenges that go with developing a good proposal, preparing and conducting meaningful and respectful fieldwork, analyzing the myriad data collected and putting it all into a story that significantly contributes to the state of knowledge, all of which you did very well, as we saw today. But Karlien, you also had to deal with the challenge of conducting fieldwork during COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, the biggest challenge of all, the passing of your loved and lovely mother. Many of us at this point would have simply quit, but not you. You juggled the caring of your ailing mother, co-organizing the funeral, giving space to the grief and the time to be together with your father and your brother, to find your way together in this new configuration. I wondered whether you would come back, but you did, with full determination. And although there may have been times of doubt, you overcame them. You fought administrative hurdles and stubbornly pursued your ideas. When lying splattered on your belly in the middle of the street, you'd just get up and walk to the sidewalk. Number 3, she is creative and perseverant. Not only because you organized one of the best Senegalese contemporary music concerts that I've ever been to, but also when things all seemed stacked against you, Karlien, you still found a way to complete your fieldwork. By chance, you had met some German female volunteers during the first fieldwork period, and through some creative thinking, you came up with a plan to investigate how German female volunteers interact with Senegalese male returnees and the affect involved in such relationships. The originality of this work came from your creative thinking, going beyond the original intentions of the PhD proposal, adapting to the COVID-19 circumstances, and from your perseverance to pull it off. So when you fall, you just dust off your pants and you move on, just like in the picture. 4, she is observant and deep. Right from the start, you were a good field observer. Every time you came back from the field, you had rich stories to tell. At first, you may not have recognized how much these stories revealed about returnee masculinities, but over the course of your PhD trajectory, we saw how you increasingly learned the art of dissecting, of digging deeper into what you observed and pulling out the significant story. You asked yourself questions and you were never satisfied with the first or easiest answer. And with your rich knowledge of Senegalese context, you were able to explain the empirical and theoretical significance of what you observed. You always asked, what happened here? Just like you did in the photo. And honestly, I don't know how many of us, after falling splattered in the middle of the road, would have just gotten up and then been interested in investigating the bicycle, rather than checking our bodies and the bones for potentially broken limbs. So dearest Karlien, it has been a long journey, full of ups and downs, falling splattered on the cobbled street and getting back up again. But it has been a fulfilling journey for you, as today you have obtained your PhD degree, the first one in your family. And also for Ulrike and myself, it has been a fulfilling journey. This was a PhD in the humanities and social sciences, which had its challenges. It had its challenges of bringing together theories and concepts on gender studies that were often developed in the West, and to make them correspond or jive with your fieldwork data. But these challenges also led to a lot of engaging conversations from which all of us learned, Ulrike, myself, and you. So in discussing your rich field notes, by hearing about the knowledge of the Senegalese context, by suggesting, when Ulrike and I would suggest literature and seeing how you took it on board and then went beyond it, was such a fulfilling experience, Karlien. So also on behalf of Ulrike, we are so incredibly proud of you today. May this experience and all that you have learned along the way continue to enrich your future endeavors. Karlien, proficiat.
It is now my pleasure to close this beautiful ceremony with the following words. Dear Dr. Strijbosch, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I now congratulate you with the degree you have acquired. Now you can let go and enjoy and celebrate with all your loved ones who are here today, and we will join you for that. Before we do so, we'll just still take a picture here and on the stairs, and I would like to ask your guests to already go to the Refter and also not wait in the cold corridor, but try to congratulate Karlien as soon as she will join us. So, enjoy and celebrate. And now we take a picture.